Right now in the mountains of western Iran, something is happening that almost nobody outside the region is watching. Thousands of Kurdish fighters are moving through terrain the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has spent 40 years claiming it fully controls, and for the first time in over a decade, that claim is falling apart in real time. While the entire world's cameras have been locked onto Tehran this past week, where a nation buried its assassinated supreme leader in a funeral that stretched across multiple days, a second, quieter war has been exploding across 3 separate provinces of Iranian Kurdistan, and unlike the funeral, this one isn't being staged for anyone. There are no cameras invited. Iran does not want you to see this. So, let's ask the question. Everyone should be asking right now, what did thousands of Kurdish fighters just do to Iran? And why is it happening at the exact moment Iran's entire government looks like it's coming apart at the seams? Here's what's actually confirmed, verified independently by human rights monitors, including the Kurdistan Human Rights Network and the Hang organization, and corroborated by multiple outlets including Reuters, Al-Azhar, and Middle East Eye. On the night of June 27th, fighters from the Eastern Kurdistan Defense Units, the armed wing of the Kurdistan Free Life Party known as PJAK, came under sustained fire from IRGC forces operating out of the Hamza Seda al-Shia headquarters near the Gagash Heights between Mahabad and Piranhar. When it was over, Kurdish sources confirmed multiple fighters dead. The IRGC claimed a higher number. Neither figure has been independently verified in full, but the fighting was real, and it was the opening shot of what came next. 2 days later, on June 29th, a previously unknown Kurdish group calling itself Kori Ha Son of Hope claimed its very first operation, gunning down 2 locally recruited IRGC-linked men outside their own homes in the city of Pava in Kermanshah province. Not a remote outpost, a city. That single detail tells you everything about how deep this network now reaches inside Iranian society itself. Then came July 1st, the deadliest night of the entire wave, and the one every major outlet from Fox News to Iran Wire to the Jerusalem Post has now confirmed. IRGC forces ambushed a vehicle carrying 6 fighters from the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan near the village of Keskapan, close to Paishar. According to the party's own statement, these men were on a political and organizational mission, not a combat operation. When a heavily equipped IRGC force cut them down, all 6 were killed. Karo Hormoyari, Faradin Changizi, Mohammed Kaki, Abdullah Mohammed Poor, Tuano Osmani, and Mohammed Amin Bazidi. Iranian state media initially reported only 5 deaths and left Bayazidi's name out entirely. Local sources say he was the driver and an active member of the party's underground network inside Iran. That's not a clerical error. That's Iran trying to hide exactly how deep this movement has already burrowed into its own territory. The bloodshed didn't stop there. 3 police officers were killed at a checkpoint in Banat in Kurdistan province, an attack that also wounded a 3-year-old girl caught in the crossfire. A separate ambush on the Banas-Sakaz road killed 3 more government personnel. Independent trackers, compiling this entire 2-week window count, at least 20 deaths, roughly split between Iranian security forces and Kurdish fighters with disputed claims on both sides, pushing the real number higher. Researchers monitoring the region are already calling this the deadliest confrontation between Tehran and its Kurdish opposition in more than 10 years. Majid Glee, president of the American Kurdish Committee, put it to Fox News Digital in blunt terms just days ago. This is not business as usual. This is not like periodic clashes on the border. This is operations, and it seems to be deep inside. He pointed to a staggering figure. More than 850 separate Iranian strikes on Kurdish areas and opposition camps since the war with the US and Israel began back on February 28th. Strikes that, according to Kurdish human rights monitors, never actually stopped, even during the so-called ceasefire. And here's the part that should genuinely stop you. This Kurdish escalation isn't happening in isolation. It's erupting at the precise moment Iran's fragile ceasefire with Washington has itself begun to collapse. Just this week, the United States hit more than 80 Iranian targets in a single night, then followed up with another wave the very next night, targeting sites from Bandar Abbas to Bushehr to the Strait of Hormuz coastline itself. Iran retaliated by firing dozens of missiles and drones at American bases in Bahrain and Kuwait. President Trump stood at the NATO summit in Ankara this week and declared the ceasefire flatly over. So picture the position Iran's regime is actually in right now. This week, not hypothetically, fighting a resurgent war with the United States along its southern coast, burying an assassinated supreme leader whose own son has not shown his face in public even once since taking power, and now bleeding personnel across a 100-mile front in the Zagros Mountains, where it is losing ambush after ambush to a Kurdish coalition it insists doesn't even really exist as an organized threat. Before we go further into exactly who these fighters are, how they're organized, and why Iran's radar and surveillance along this exact stretch of border seems to have gone dark at precisely the wrong moment for Tehran. Subscribe and stay with me because the terrain advantage the Kurds are exploiting right now is something Iran genuinely cannot fix with drones or artillery, and it's about to get worse for them. So who exactly is doing this to Iran right now? Because this is not one militia. It's not a single command structure issuing orders from a bunker somewhere in the mountains. This is a coalition of 5 separate Kurdish factions, each bringing a completely different capability to the fight. And understanding that structure is the key to understanding why Iran genuinely cannot stop what's happening. The most battle-age hard-hardened of them all is the Eastern Kurdistan Defense Units, the armed wing of PJAK, the Kurdistan Free Life Party. These are the fighters operating out of the Kandel mountain range on the Iran-Iraq border, drawing on more than 2 decades of guerrilla warfare experience with a genuinely significant number of women serving in combat roles. Their method is simple and brutally effective. Small infiltration teams, often around 6 fighters moving under cover of darkness from mountain staging points, striking IRGC checkpoints and convoys with precision, then vanishing straight back into ridgeal lines that Iranian drones consistently failed to track. That's exactly the unit that clashed with the IRGC at Gagish Heights on June 27th. Then there's the Democratic Party of Iranian Kurdistan, the PDKI, and their capability looks nothing like PJ's. This is not primarily a combat force. It's a deep embedded human intelligence network reaching directly inside Kurdish majority cities across Iran itself. That's precisely the kind of network connected to Mohammad Amin Bazidi, the driver killed in the July 1st ambush, whose name Iranian state media conveniently left out of its own casualty report. Someone with active ties inside Iranian society who could feed real-time information on garrison locations, patrol schedules, and troop movements back to the coalition. The kind of intelligence no satellite or drone can fully replace. The Kurdistan Freedom Party, known as PAC, has been the most consistently offensive-minded of the 5, running planned strike operations against IRGC infrastructure in Kermanshah and Khorasan provinces for years before this current war even started. According to Wikipedia's ongoing tracker of this crisis, PAK claimed multiple attacks on IRGC positions across Kermanshah and Isfahan back in January and reported being hit by retaliatory Iranian missile strikes days later. A pattern of tit-for-tat escalation that's been building for months, long before most of the world ever noticed, and rounding out the coalition are the Kamala organization and Kamala itself. Both bringing decades of institutional history operating along this exact stretch of border. Here's what's genuinely fascinating and what analysts at places like the Jerusalem Post have picked up on. Despite operating in the same narrow tow window, researchers have found no clear evidence these 5 groups are running a single centrally coordinated command. PJAK has been locked in a cycle of direct retaliation. The PDKI has been losing fighters mainly through the interception of clandestine, low-profile organizational missions, which worryingly for them suggests Iranian intelligence may have penetrated their networks more than they'd like to admit. In Korwa, the newest and most mysterious of the bunch, has pursued an entirely different method. Targeted assassinations of local auxiliary personnel rather than open combat. 3 different groups, 3 different tactics, all erupting in the same window in the same general region without a shared operations room dictating any of it. That's not one offensive, that's several separate breaking points hit at almost exactly the same time. Now let's talk about why the terrain itself is doing so much of the fighting for them. The Zagros Mountains are some of the most unforgiving ground on Earth, ridgelines running past 10,000 feet narrow gorges with effectively no road access, valleys that funnel any mechanized force onto a single vulnerable route with zero ability to maneuver around an ambush. Iran's helicopter gunships already flying on aging underpowered airframes struggle to even function at these altitudes. That means the IRGC is fighting this specific campaign largely without meaningful air support. Armored columns get bottlenecked onto single roads through these valleys, making them extraordinarily easy targets for ambush tactics. Kurdish fighters have spent literal decades refining on this exact ground. The defenders have memorized every fold and gorge of terrain that Iranian forces are only now being forced to relearn under fire in real time while losing people. There's another piece to this that deserves real attention. Why is Iran's ability to detect this insurgency apparently so degraded right now at the worst possible moment? During the opening weeks of the war back in late February, American and Israeli strikes specifically targeted Iranian radar sites, command nodes, and air defense infrastructure across huge stretches of the country, including installations along this exact Zagros corridor that had previously helped Iran monitor cross-Kurdish movement. By multiple accounts, those early warning systems went dark during that campaign and were never meaningfully restored. Whether that was a deliberate side effect meant to open a corridor for exactly this kind of Kurdish activity, or simply an unintended consequence of a much larger strategic bombing effort, is genuinely difficult to say with certainty from the outside. But the practical result is identical either way. Iran's ability to see this insurgency coming has been meaningfully broken at precisely the moment Kurdish frustration fed by more than 850 cross-border Iranian strikes on their own camps in Iraq has been building toward exactly this kind of response. And it's worth remembering that this coalition didn't spring out of nowhere. Back in December of last year, 7 separate Iranian Kurdish opposition groups joined together explicitly to support the wave of anti-government protests sweeping Iran. That coalition building accelerated further on February 22nd, just 6 days before the American and Israeli strikes opened this entire war when 5 of the largest parties formally united under what's now called the Coalition of Political Forces of Iranian Kurdistan with one explicitly stated goal: toppling the regime and achieving real Kurdish self-determination. That early unity was tested almost immediately. In the opening days of the war, multiple outlets, including Israel's The 24 News, reported that a Kurdish-led ground offensive had already begun near Marivan. Those reports turned out to be premature. PJAK, PDKI, PAK, and Kamala all publicly denied any offensive had started, and Kurdistan regional government officials stated flatly that not a single Iraqi Kurdish fighter had crossed the border. The coalition, it turned out, was being deliberately cautious, unwilling to risk exposing its fighters to a devastating crackdown before the timing was actually right. That caution is exactly what appears to be eroding right now. And the U.S., here's the part of this story that almost nobody outside specialist Kurdish and Middle East reporting has actually connected, and it explains exactly why Kurdish frustration is curdled into open operations right now. According to reporting from the Washington Post and confirmed by Wikipedia's ongoing tracker of this crisis, President Trump personally offered extensive U.S. air cover and other backing to anti-regime Iranian Kurdish groups early in this war to help them seize territory in western Iran. In direct Iran, Kurdish opposition figures ran with it. One told reporters bluntly, "We can't move if the air above us is not cleared," openly calling for something resembling the no-fly zones that let Iraqi Kurds establish real autonomy after 1991 for a brief window, and did not want Kurdish fighters entering the war, calling the conflict complicated enough and saying he didn't want to see Kurds get hurt or killed. Reporting from Channel 12 in Israel later revealed there had actually been a broader plan drawn up for a coordinated offensive involving all 6 major Kurdish factions, a plan that quietly died before it ever launched. Why did it die? One word: Turkey. Ankara has consistently and forcefully opposed any serious American or Israeli arming of Iranian Kurdish factions, specifically because of the organizational and ideological links between PJ and the PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, which Turkey has fought for decades and formally designates a terrorist organization. That Turkish pressure reportedly played a direct role in scaling back official U.S. support plans, even after Trump had already told Kurdish leaders he wanted to see them succeed. It's one of the more genuinely complicated diplomatic tangles running underneath this entire war. Washington needing Turkey as a NATO partner while simultaneously flirting with backing a movement Ankara considers existential. And then there's the sentence in the actual U.S.-Iran Memorandum of Understanding that Kurdish leaders say changed everything. But Jade Glide told reporters that language in the deal, widely interpreted as Washington agreeing not to interfere in Iran's internal affairs, landed as a genuine betrayal. This sentence has taken every Iranian opposition group the wrong way, especially the Kurds, he said, invoking Ronald Reagan's Cold War era approach of publicly backing freedom movements, even while negotiating with a hostile power. In other words, Kurdish factions watched Washington quietly write them out of the deal that was supposed to end the war, and then kept absorbing Iranian strikes anyway. Ceasefire or no ceasefire. That combination, abandonment on paper plus continued bombardment in practice, is a big part of what's driving fighters into these mountains right now. And that ceasefire itself deserves a serious update because as of this week, it has Europe and President Masoud Pezeshkian signing in Tehran the next day. It was supposed to hold for 60 days while the two sides worked out a permanent deal, including the fate of the Strait of Hormuz. It didn't survive 3 weeks intact. Iran launched drone and missile strikes against commercial vessels transiting the strait in early July. The U.S. responded by striking more than 80 Iranian targets on the night of July 7th into the 8th and reimposed the oil sanctions it had agreed to lift under the deal. Iran responded by firing roughly 85 missiles and drones at U.S. bases in Bahrain and Kuwait. A second night of even larger U.S. strikes followed, hitting around 90 targets from Badabas to Bushehr near Iran's own nuclear power plant complex. At least 14 people in Iran were killed and dozens more wounded over those 2 nights alone, according to Iran's own health ministry. Talks to continue. Layer that directly on top of the Kurdish insurgency, and you start to see just how many simultaneous fires Iran's leadership is now fighting. Because at the exact same moment American strikes were hitting Iran's southern coast, the country was also in the middle of burying its own assassinated supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, killed in the joint U.S.-Israeli operation that opened this entire war back on February 28th. Days of funeral processions stretched across Thran and even into Karbala, Iraq. And the one person who was conspicuously, repeatedly absent from nearly every single ceremony, his own son and successor, Mojtaba Kham, the man who is now technically Iran's supreme leader. Sources have told CNN he's barely appeared publicly at all since taking the position, a detail made considerably more alarming by the fact that Israel has reportedly shared intelligence with Washington, describing an active Iranian plot to assassinate President Trump himself. Now, overlay the Strait of Hormuz dispute. On top of that, Iran's ambassador to China announced on July 4th that Tehran intends to start charging service fees on ships transiting the strait, framing it as payment for security, administration, and environmental monitoring rather than an illegal toll. The United States has rejected that framing entirely and without qualification. Secretary of State Marco Rubio stating plainly that no country is permitted to charge fees on an international waterway, a position the White House has repeated over and over. Iran and Oman jointly presented Washington with a fee collection framework anyway. It went nowhere. And now, with the ceasefire itself in tatters, that entire dispute over who controls one of the most economically important choke points on the planet is essentially back on the table unresolved, with Iranian strikes on shipping already dragging straight traffic back down toward wartime lows. So here's Iran's actual position this week in real terms. Not speculation, not analysis, just the plain list of what's confirmed. A ceasefire with the United States that's collapsed twice in the space of a few days. A newly installed supreme leader who has not been seen in public since taking power amid a credible assassination threat against the American president. A dispute over the Strait of Hormuz with a deadline that's already blown past and produced renewed military strikes instead of resolution. And now running underneath every single one of those headline crises, a multi-province Kurdish insurgency killing IRGC personnel in ambush after ambush across Tehran, the regime cannot meaningfully control. That is not a government managing one crisis. That is a government trying to fight on four fronts simultaneously. And the fourth one, the one happening in the mountains, is the one it's trying hardest to make sure the rest of the world never really looks at. So where does all of this actually leave Iran right now as this week draws to a close? And more importantly, what happens next? Let's start with the honest, unglamorous truth that most breathless coverage of this story tends to skip over. Nobody, not even analysts who track this exact region for a living, is confident about where this goes. Some point to the casualty numbers among Kurdish fighters themselves. Real losses, real names, real funerals on their own side too, as evidence that this coalition has genuine operational limits and may not be able to sustain a campaign at this intensity for long. Others point to the sheer geographic spread of it. 3 separate provinces, multiple distinct groups, all erupting inside the same narrow 2-week window. That kind of simultaneous multi-front eruption is not what routine border friction looks like. It's what the early stages of something considerably larger tend to look like before anyone's fully willing to call it that out loud. What is not in dispute is the human cost. And it's worth sitting with the actual names for a second because it's easy to let a story like this dissolve into abstractions. Provinces, percentages, strategic corridors, Kara Hormoyari, Farar Denizi, Mohammad Kaki, Abdullah Mohammadur, Douan Osmani, Mohammad Aminazidi. 6 men killed in a single ambush near Pishar on July 1st, independently confirmed by the Kurdistan Human Rights Network, Henga, and multiple international outlets. And they are just 6 of dozens of names now sitting in a documented record that human rights organizations have been carefully verifying one by one, rather than simply repeating whatever number either side wants published. Here's the bigger picture worth holding on to: Iran's own strategy for dealing with this insurgency. Hundreds of drone and missile strikes against Kurdish opposition camps across the border in Iraq. More than 850 of them since February has a structural flaw that isn't going away. The most capable elements of these coalition forces simply aren't sitting in exposed camps waiting to be hit. They're embedded in mountain terrain, tunnel networks, and cave systems built up over literal decades of prior insurgency. The same kind of terrain, notably that helped an American aircrew evade capture during an earlier phase of this broader war. Fixed-wing strikes and drone runs against that kind of dispersed, deeply dug-in terrain produce minimal lasting effect. Iran is in a very real sense burning through its own drone inventory against targets it fundamentally cannot destroy, while the actual command core of this Kurdish coalition sits largely untouched, and Iran's senior leadership knows it. The commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Guards made a rare public appearance during this exact window, his first since the war began back in February, and did it wearing a plain baseball cap surrounded by plainclothes security rather than the formal military escort a man of his rank would normally command. That is not the body language of confident control. That's the body language of someone who understands at a basic operational level that his own visibility now carries real personal risk. There's also a wider global backdrop worth keeping in view here because Iran's unraveling isn't happening in a vacuum. This same week, North Korea's Kim Jong-un personally supervised weapons trials aboard a new 5,000-ton guided missile destroyer, watching it. Testfire, a strategic cruise missile believed capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, and ordering the ship fully commissioned within 2 months. It's a reminder that this exact moment in global security involves multiple flashpoints developing in parallel, each one competing for a finite amount of international attention, even as every individual crisis keeps escalating largely on its own separate clock. So here's the honest way to frame where things stand. A coalition of Kurdish fighters with real tactical skill and decades of accumulated knowledge of terrain that consistently neutralizes Iran's technological edge has killed a documented, independently verified number of IRGC personnel across 3 provinces in barely 2 weeks while absorbing real losses of its own in the process. Iran's response, hundreds of crossbow strikes into Iraq, has produced minimal lasting effect against an enemy built for exactly this kind of fight. Iran's senior military leadership is making rare cautious appearances in disguise rather than operating from a position of visible strength. And every single one of these developments is unfolding directly alongside a ceasefire with the United States that has now collapsed twice in a matter of days. A newly installed supreme leader who has not been seen in public since taking power, and an unresolved fight over the Strait of Hormuz that's already produced fresh airstrikes instead of a settlement that is an extraordinary amount of simultaneous pressure for any government to absorb, let alone one this fractured at the very top of its own command structure. Whether this specific wave of Kurdish resistance becomes the opening chapter of something genuinely historic, a real unraveling of Iranian control over its own western periphery, at the precise moment its central government is most exposed, or whether it eventually settles back into the kind of intermittent border violence that's defined this relationship for decades, is a question nobody serious is willing to answer with confidence right now. What we do know is this: the fight in the Zagros Mountains is continuing on its own terms, largely unwatched by a world distracted by funeral processions and collapsing diplomatic deadlines, and it shows no sign of stopping. So here's the question I actually want to leave you with. With Iran now fighting on 4 fronts at once, Washington, Hormuz, its own succession crisis, and now an entrenched Kurdish insurgency it cannot dislodge, how much longer can a regime this fractured actually hold all of it together? Drop your take in the comments, because I genuinely want to know what you think happens next. And if this kind of on the ground, no fluff breakdown of what's actually happening in the Middle East right now is what you come here for, hit subscribe, because this story is nowhere near finished. And I'll be back the moment the next major development breaks.